Welcome to Philosophy 104, Studies Section 1, Notion of Inquiry. Introduction. In this study session, we shall examine the notion of inquiry and see whether it differs from process skill. Our emphasis shall be on philosophical inquiry as a unique form of inquiry that involves conceptual and logical analysis, positing and explaining distinctions, evoking shared ideas and values. To achieve this objective, we shall first consider what we mean by inquiry, and then proceed to explore two basic forms of inquiry: scientific inquiry and philosophical inquiry. Afterwards, we shall take a brief look at the process of inquiry and narrow down our discourse to philosophical inquiry. We shall contextualize the discourse by exposing the notion of inquiry in the philosophy of John Dewey. Finally, we shall conclude with brief illustrations and examples concerning what is being inquired into in some arms of philosophy. Learning outcomes. After the study section, you should be able to describe the nature and scope of philosophical inquiry, contrast the two types of inquiry, explain the notion of inquiry using a philosopher's standpoint, defining inquiry. Though the notion inquiry is somewhat elusive to define from its common usage, the word means any quest or search for knowledge or truth. These quests have mainly been undertaken with regard either to aspects of reality or to the whole of reality. Inquiry is about logic. It is about reasoning from data, and it is about applying scientific techniques and skills to real-world problems. In other words, inquiry could be defined as a seeking for truth, information, or knowledge by raising questions. The process of inquiring could be said to begin with gathering information and data through applying the human senses of seeing, hearing, touching, tasting, and smelling. Types of inquiries. There are two basic forms of inquiry we shall concern ourselves with in this study section. These are scientific inquiry and philosophical inquiry. Scientific inquiry. Scientific inquiry refers to the diverse ways in which scientists study the natural world and propose explanations based on the evidence derived from their work. It also refers to the activities of students in which they develop knowledge and understanding of scientific ideas, as well as understanding of how scientists study the natural world. Scientific inquiry is a multifaceted activity that involves making observations, posing questions, examining various sources of information to see what is already known, planning investigations, reviewing what is already known in light of experimental evidence, using tools to gather, analyze, and interpret data, proposing answers, explanations, and predictions, and communicating the results. It requires identification of assumptions, use of critical and logical thinking, and consideration of alternative explanations. Students will engage in selected aspects of this inquiry as they learn the scientific way of knowing the natural world. They also develop the capacity to conduct complete inquiries. There are three methods of scientific inquiry, viz. Reintroduction, induction, and colligation. Reintroduction depends on our capacity to guess at the conditions under which a given kind of phenomenon will present itself. Reintroduction is similar to induction, while induction involves reasoning from data to generality, retroduction involves reasoning about why things happen, including why the data appear the way they do, used by critical realists. Colligation involves linking facts together by a general description or by a hypothesis that applies to them all. To be specific, scientific method represents a form of inquiry concerned with hypothesis development, data collection, analysis, and interpretation. The inquiry process takes advantage of the natural human desire to make sense of the world. This attitude of curiosity permeates the inquiry process and is the fuel that allows it to continue. In sum, with the use of scientific inquiry, one develops the ability to think and act in ways associated with scientific methodology, including asking questions, planning and conducting investigations, using appropriate tools and techniques to gather data, thinking critically and logically about relationships between evidence and explanations, constructing and analyzing alternative explanations, and communicating scientific arguments. Philosophical inquiry. Philosophical inquiry involves attempting to answer the most fundamental questions about life. Also, philosophical inquiry involves an investigation of the fundamental questions of human existence. Such questions include wondering about such things as the meaning of life, what kinds of things the universe is made of, whether there can be a theory of everything, how we can know what the right thing to do is, and what is the beautiful in life and art. Other disciplines are concerned with these sorts of questions also, but philosophers more often than not either attempt to provide adequate reasons and justifications for their beliefs or attempt to clarify and examine the basis for those beliefs. Philosophical inquiry could be said to be the mother of all other inquiries on the ground that most disciplines and fields of inquiry we have today broke off from it to become independent disciplines. The natural sciences separated early. The separation of philosophy from psychology is only about a century old. Still, boundaries remain blurred for most disciplines as well as professions admit to at least a foundational philosophical component. At this point, it will be expedient to consider some branches of philosophy and see what form of inquiry they are engaged in. Inquiry and its branches of philosophy. Epistemology can be seen as the inquiry into what knowledge is, what can be known, and what lies beyond our understanding, the investigation into the origin, structure, methods, and validity of justification and knowledge, the study of the interrelation of reason, truth, and experience. Metaphysics could be regarded too as the inquiry into what is real as opposed to what is appearance, either conceived as that which the methods of science presuppose or that with which the methods of science are concerned. The inquiry into the first principles of nature, the study of the most fundamental generalizations as to what exists. Axiology, which is also known as theory of value, could be considered to be the inquiry into the nature, criteria, and metaphysical status of value. Finally, aesthetics could be viewed as the inquiry into feelings, judgment, or standards concerning the nature of beauty and related concepts such as the tragic, the sublime, or the moving, especially in the arts, the analysis of the values of sensory experience and the associated feelings or attitudes in art and nature, the theories developed in liberal arts. Review of philosophical underpinnings or notion of inquiry. John Dewey and the notion of inquiry. Inquiry was one of the core concepts in John Dewey's philosophy. Dewey stressed the importance of inquiry in the education of young children. He argued that children learn by doing things and try ideas out, and not merely by memorizing lessons and repeating them back to their teachers. In books that he addressed primarily to philosophers, such as logic, the theory of inquiry, Dewey discussed the technical aspect of inquiry. It was in this work, in fact, that he gave us his most succinct definition of the term. According to Dewey, inquiry is the controlled or directed transformation of an indeterminate situation into one that is determinate in its constituent distinctions and relations as to convert the element of the original situation into a unified whole. In Dewey's opinion, inquiry is called for whenever we sense that something is indeterminate or out of balance. Such situations may range from the trivial to the life-threatening. It is important to note, however, that Dewey avoided subjectivism. It is the all-experienced situation and not just the experiencing subject that is problematic. We do not know in advance whether we will need to alter things that are external relative to us or accommodate ourselves to them. In fact, Dewey thought that resolution, or what he called adjustment, usually requires a mix of both alteration and accommodation. In any case, a problematic situation must be analyzed so as to identify which of its elements are relevant to the problem at hand, and then those elements must be reconstructed so as to restore harmony and balance. Furthermore, Dewey thought that inquiry is an observable behavioral process that is as natural as walking or chewing. He therefore rejected the idea that it is something mysterious that goes or inside the head. Even so, training in the techniques of inquiry should be a part of the education of young children. An adult too, if they are to continue to grow, must make the improvement of their inquirential skills a part of a program of lifelong learning. The goal of successful inquiry is for Dewey more than a simple return to the proud status quo. Successful inquiry results in growth and in the enrichment of the meanings of our experiences. Dewey contrasted disciplined experimental inquiry to other methods that have historically proven to be of less value in the settlement of belief, such as luck, tenacity, authority, and appeals to whatever seems a priori reasonable. The problem with such methods is that whenever they are employed, inquiry is cut short and intelligence invariably suffers. Luck is not reproducible. Tenacity lacks a social dimension. Authority discourages individual effort and appeals to a priori reasonableness. Exclude experimentation. Reading this the other way around, we can see that for Dewey, inquiry is experimental, it requires individual effort, it is situated in a social context, and it is the best way so far devised to secure what we determine to be the good things of life. Unlike all its alternatives, inquiry is self-correcting. Charles Sanders Peirce and the nature of inquiry. It is the belief among some that it was with the work of Charles Sanders Peirce, 1839 to 1914, that American philosophy really came of age. Around 1872, C.S. Peirce joined William James, Chauncey Wright, Oliver Wendell Holmes, and others in a discussion group known as the Metaphysical Club. In Cambridge, Peirce was a highly original thinker. Like many another 19th century philosopher, he took as his starting point the philosophy of Immanuel Kant, whose critique of pure reason he claimed to know almost by heart. His work ranged widely not only over logic in the narrow sense, but also encompassing theory of language, epistemology, and philosophy of mind. He was the originator of one of the most influential American schools of philosophy, namely pragmatism. Peirce is also noted to have discussed how inquiry ought to be carried out, and this, it can be said, underlay his philosophy. Let us look at what Peirce says about the nature of inquiry. In his article, The Fixation of Belief, Peirce attacks traditional epistemology for constructing thought as the detached acquisition of truth. Rather, he emphasizes that thought has the job of producing beliefs. For Peirce, beliefs are neither not pieces of mental furniture residing in the mind, nor are they momentary psychological states. Instead, our beliefs guide our desires and shape our actions. To the question of whether it matters how we arrive at beliefs, Peirce answers in the affirmative, for, according to him, ends cannot be separated from the means we use to achieve them. It therefore enunciates 4 ways to achieve belief, of which only one will prove to be satisfactory. The first way of eliminating doubt is what Peirce calls the method of tenacity. This method involves setting rationality aside and clinging to personal opinions with determination and perseverance. Admitting that the method of tenacity would work for someone who may never have his ideas subjected to analysis, Peirce avers that employ this method may cause doubt to rise when the beliefs arrived at through this method are subjected to rational scrutiny. The second way of fixing belief is the method of authority. This is the method employed by a community of believers who allow their beliefs to be dictated by an authority or by an institution. It corrects the problem of the first method, for this one will ensure that an individual's beliefs are consistent with that of the community. Peirce says that great civilizations, such as ancient Egypt and medieval Europe, have been built on this method. The third method is the a priori method. It is better than the 2 first methods on the grounds that in using the a priori method, one arrives at beliefs after a process of reflection. By the a priori method, Peirce does not mean basing beliefs on logical necessity, but embracing beliefs because they are agreeable to reason. However, what is agreeable to reason is very subjective, for it is based on personal inclinations and sentiments. Peirce thinks that the adoption of the a priori will lead to the absence of a settled or agreed opinion, because each thinker who uses the a priori method has different preferences about what he or she personally considers to be beyond doubt. In Peirce's view, the problems with the previous 3 methods illustrate that what is important is not just finding belief, but finding it in a certain way. What is needed is a method of fixing belief that does not depend on our human idiosyncrasies but on some external permanency. The method must be such that the ultimate conclusion of every man shall be the same. To this end, Peirce proposes the fourth and final method, the method of science. By this, Peirce does not necessarily mean what is done by scientists in laboratories, but instead what could be broadly considered an empirical procedure. The fundamental hypothesis underlying this method is that there are real things whose characters are entirely independent of our opinions about them. Those realities affect our senses according to regular laws, and by taking advantage of the laws of perception, we can ascertain by reasoning how things really and truly are. IBID 464. For Peirce, this fourth method has been successful in helping us resolve doubt because the method will lead to its own confirmation when applied, although the other methods make it possible to maintain an internally coherent system. They do so at the expense of being immune from all correction. In contrast, the method of science is error-revealing and self-corrective since it is tested against what is independent of our cherished beliefs or wishes. The relation of Peirce's thesis on the nature of inquiry reflects in his pragmatic theory to the effect that the beliefs we seek through inquiry will only be meaningful and useful if they are clear. To this end, Peirce's pragmatism can be considered as a rule of procedure for promoting linguistic and conceptual clarity. Pragmatism was the most influential philosophy in America in the first quarter of the 20th century. As a movement, it is best understood, in part, as a critical rejection of much traditional academic philosophy and also as a concern to establish certain positive aims. It is in this respect, rather than because of any one idea or exclusive doctrine, that pragmatism has been the most distinctive and the major contribution of America to the world of philosophy. The historical occasion of the birth of pragmatism is complicated because it was to some extent the product of cooperative deliberation and mutual influences within the metaphysical club. In this sense, pragmatism is often spoken of as a theory of meaning first developed by Charles Sanders Peirce in the 1870s, revived and reformulated in 1898 by William James, primarily as a theory of truth, and further developed, expanded, and disseminated by John Dewey. One important point of distinction between Peirce's conception of pragmatism and that of James is Peirce's emphasis on viewing pragmatism as method. Indeed, he often remarked that pragmatism is not a philosophy, a metaphysic, or a theory of truth. It is not a solution or answer to anything, but a technique to help us find solutions to problems of a philosophical or scientific nature. One of Peirce's best known statements of the technique was in How to Make Our Ideas Clear, where he says that in order to ascertain the meaning of an intellectual conception, one should consider what practical consequences might conceivably result by necessity from the truth of that conception, and the sum of these consequences will constitute the entire meaning of the conception. Peirce considered pragmatism a method of ascertaining the meaning of hard words and abstract concepts, or again, a method of ascertaining the meanings not of all ideas, but intellectual concepts, that is to say, of those upon the structure of which argument concerning objective fact may hinge. Peirce considered pragmatism a method of ascertaining the meaning of hard words and abstract concepts, or again, a method of ascertaining the meanings not of all ideas but intellectual concepts, that is to say, of those upon the structure of which arguments concerning objective fact may hinge. Thus, for Peirce, pragmatism is a method of clarifying the meaning of various words, ideas, concepts, and sometimes of objects. Studies section summary. In this study section, you examine the notion of inquiry and see whether it differs from process skill. Our emphasis was on philosophical inquiry as a unique form of inquiry that involves conceptual and logical analysis, positing and explaining distinctions, evoking shared ideas and values. We capped this section with reviews on philosophical proposition of John Dewey and Charles Peirce. This is the end of study section 1. Thanks for listening.